Buyurun.
Good afternoon and good morning, everyone, depending on where you are joining us from. And thank you for coming to our next webinar organized by the Department of Political Science and International Relations in cooperation with the RCNCR, the Research Center for Neighboring Countries and Regions here at Istanbul Commerce University. I'm Kamala Valiyeva, a faculty member and a deputy director of the RCNCR, which is a research center, university-based research center, where we study developments in Turkey's close vicinity and its relationships with wider regions. The focal point of today's event is the discussion of the Nagorno-Karabakh dispute between Armenia and Azerbaijan 1 year after the so-called 44 days war, which has turned to be devastating for the Armenian side and at the same time victorious for Azerbaijan. This was a triumphant moment for Azerbaijan since after a long period of Armenian occupation of its sovereign territories, the war allowed Baku to restore justice and territorial integrity, even though partially. As a result of the war, which radically changed the status quo in the confrontation between two sides, Azerbaijan managed to reverse the losses it suffered in the conflict of the early 1990s, leaving the Armenian side defeated and humiliated. But along with the interstate and even intrastate implications, Second Karabakh War shifted the entire geopolitical power configuration in South Caucasus region, setting trends that may have long-term consequences. The war sparked the new discussions on the changing role and place of the region in both regional and extra-regional major powers' strategic intentions. And most importantly, Russia inserted itself into the heart of the conflict zone this time, for the first time, through the introduction of a peacekeeping force in Karabakh itself. But the trilateral ceasefire agreement brokered by Russia is not an Armenian-Azerbaijani peace agreement that resolves the status of Nagorno-Karabakh, which was the very issue that triggered the conflict back in 1988. And a normalization of relations between Baku and Yerevan looks as vague as ever, whether such agreement will be negotiated in the foreseeable future or not remains to be seen. Well, to discuss this today, we are joined by Dr. Ali Askerov, whom I'm very thankful for coming to our event, and whom I also would like to briefly introduce to our virtual audience. Ali Askerov is an associate professor and director of graduate study in the Department of Peace and Conflict Studies at the University of North Carolina-Greensboro, UNCG. He has a PhD in Peace and Conflict Studies from the University of Manitoba in Canada, MA in Conflict Analysis and Resolution from the George Mason University in the US, and BA in International Relations from Middle East Technical University in Turkey. Dr. Askerov previously taught peace studies, international relations, political history, and political ideas and ideologies at the University of Winnipeg, University of Manitoba, and University of Regina. He has written extensively on the wide range of issues such as ethnic conflict, terrorism, mediation, peace education, conflict transformation, refugee issues, and structural violence. Askerov is an author or co-author of several books that include Post-Soviet Conflict, the 30 Years Crisis, published in 2020, Contemporary Russo-Turkish Relations from Crisis to Cooperation, published in 2018, Transformative Change and Introduction to Peace and Conflict Studies, and Historical Dictionary of Chechen Conflict, both published in 2015, and finally, Chechens from Past to Future, Healing the Wounds, a book published in 2012. Dr. Askerov's current research includes refugee issues, contending interests of Russia and Turkey in Syria, the collusion of legitimate and covert politics in the Middle East, international terrorism, and identity formation and change. With this short introduction and without further delay, I invite our speaker to deliver his presentation entitled The Nagorno-Karabakh Conflict, Post-War State of Affairs, and Obstacles to Permanent Peace. Dr. Askerov, good to see you, and please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Greetings, everyone. Thanks for organizing this event. It's a great honor to speak on this topic in front of you, and the introduction was pretty long. Thanks, Kamala. So I'm going to share my screen with you so that you could see some slides. Okay. possibly this one. Okay. So as you know, my friends, the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict is one of the oldest conflicts in the region, and one of the most stubborn, interactive conflict of the former Soviet Union that, as a matter of fact, brought the end to the Soviet Union, because nationalism or ethnic nationalism in the former Soviet Union started with this conflict in 1988, and the Soviet Union disintegrated in 1991. After about 3 years, this conflict started. The conflict is older than that, of course, but when we speak about this conflict, we speak about only about the last stage of this conflict, and it has always been part of Azerbaijan, before the Soviet rule, after the Soviet rule, and during the Soviet rule. When we speak about that in legal terms, but politically speaking, it was different. The situation was different. So let's take a look at the brief history of this conflict. The last phase of the conflict, as I mentioned, started in 1988, when one of the advisors of the Soviet ruler Gorbachev, who was the only president of the Soviet Union, because that post was just initiated in his times, Armenian Agambekyan, he was an economist, a professor and advisor of Gorbachev. He announced in Paris, during his visit to Paris in 1988, that Nagorno-Karabakh has rights to be a part of Armenia rather than part of Azerbaijan, and then Armenians started to demand it. They organized meetings, rallies, etc. in Yerevan. It was Soviet times again. It was something unusual in the Soviet state. It was against Soviet policies, but Moscow closed its eyes to these events, and this was the start of ethnic nationalism throughout the Soviet Union. But of course, ethnic nationalism, the wave of ethnic nationalism, grew gradually after Azerbaijanis started to organize rallies, demonstrations in Baku. I myself was a participant of that as a young boy at that time. And there was about 1 million of people in the square, central square in Baku, that called at that time Lenin Square. Now we call it Azatlık Square, or Özgürlük Square, or Liberty Square now. About 1 million of people, every seventh person in Azerbaijan was in that square for about 2 or 3 weeks. This was a great answer to Armenians, of course. In Moscow understood that the process could be tougher than it anticipated, but did not take real measures. It was on the side of Armenians. Then Sumgait events were organized by KGB, where some Armenians were killed by criminals, and the leader of those criminals was again an Armenian. There was a huge contingent of Soviet troops in Sumgait, the third biggest city of Azerbaijan, but they did not get involved in preventing the events. But Moscow wanted to create certain excuses to act against Azerbaijan. Then Soviet troops entered Baku in 1990 in January and killed people, close to 1,000. And it was also something unusual, although there were a couple of precedents in Tbilisi, Georgia, and Kazakhstan. Almaty, similar events happened before this one. But what's really more crucial in Armenia, in Soviet Armenia, there was a huge Turkic Azerbaijani population, and they were deported from there forcefully. And again, Moscow closed its eyes to that. So in other words, there was an ethnic cleansing. So once Azerbaijanis left Armenia, and Armenia was a Turk-free Soviet Republic, they intensified their acts. They started to speak about, first they were speaking about miatsum. Miatsum is the unification of Karabakh. They meant that Nagorno-Karabakh was supposed to be unified or reunified with Armenia. Of course, that's a false history because Karabakh never was part of Armenia. But then later in early 1990s, they changed their policy from miatsum, that's unification, to self-determination, especially when they understood that that kind of policy was successful in former Yugoslavia. In 1991, all republics, all 15 Soviet republics became independent, including Armenia, Azerbaijan, and suddenly the internal war of the Soviet Union over Nagorno-Karabakh between Armenia and Azerbaijan became an international war between independent Armenia and independent Azerbaijan. None of these countries had their armies, but Armenia prepared a long time ago, like decades before these events started. Armenia prepared secretly for this. Azerbaijan was not ready. On the other side, Russia started to help Armenia again, was on the Armenian side, and even Russia helped Armenia to commit Khojaly genocide or massacre in early 1990s, occupy Azerbaijani lands, Nagorno-Karabakh, in addition to that 7 additional administrative centers. And Russia all the time supported Armenia with weapons, and Russia's army was in Armenia, in Nagorno-Karabakh. Azerbaijan managed, especially because of the policies of Elchibey's administration at that time, to oust Russian army from Azerbaijan, and they came back recently, to the region again. But in 1994, after I have a defeat, Azerbaijan had to sign a ceasefire agreement in Bishkek, Kyrgyzstan, and Russia played a huge role in all of these processes, in the occupation of Azerbaijan lands, in killing people, in Armenia's success, in Azerbaijan's defeat. Russia played the key role. Russia saw Azerbaijan and Armenia as its backyard and never wanted to lose its influence, and still Russia tries to keep Armenia and Azerbaijan within the sphere of its influence. But just before ceasefires, Organization of Cooperation and OSCE Minsk Group, as a matter of fact, was created to mediate between Armenia and Azerbaijan. But Russia was part of that, together with France and the US. Yes, and Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe was on paper very active, but received no result. So it's conflicts, we speak about conflicts like Nagorno-Karabakh, which are bloody and stubborn, with long history. Then we speak about certain ups and downs. So conflicts escalate and de-escalate, and there are certain factors that cause conflict escalation, and there are certain factors that cause conflict de-escalation. And the conflict de-escalation stage started with the ceasefire agreement in 1994. Then negotiations started because now the parties believed that they had to negotiate because there was no solution to this conflict by war, by violence. This is the main explanation, but I disagree with that, because at that time Armenia got much more what it wanted, initially planned. The initial goal of Armenia was to occupy Nagorno-Karabakh part of Karabakh, entire Karabakh. But Armenia ended up with occupying 3 times more lands of Azerbaijan, and that was more than enough for Armenia. So Armenia preferred to have negotiations And Azerbaijan had to, because Azerbaijan understood that it had a heavy loss and it was not able to sustain the war under those conditions, fighting against Armenia that received serious help from Russia and some other Western countries. Azerbaijan was supported by Turkey on diplomatic arena in 1993, especially when Azerbaijan's administrative centers other than Nagorno-Karabakh were occupied by Armenians and Russians. Turkey helped Azerbaijan to have certain resolutions in the Security Council of the United Nations, 4 of them, which was a basis of Azerbaijan's fight against its enemies, right? In terms of diplomacy and in terms of law, international law, Azerbaijan always used and referred to those documents that were a huge support. Other than that, Azerbaijan did not receive serious support, even from Turkey, unfortunately. This was in 1990s. So still Russia played the main role in the Minsk group. As a matter of fact, Russia pursued a two-faced policy because on the one hand, Russia had a role of mediator. On the other hand, Russia was helping Armenia. So what do I mean by having a role of mediator? A mediator should be neutral and impartial. So it should place itself at the equidistance to the parties to conflict. Say, for example, Russia should be in the middle of Armenia and Azerbaijan and should never take a side when one of the mediators or the mediators, if it is alone, loses the sense of impartiality and neutrality. It means that it loses its legitimacy. So Russia was not legitimate as a mediator because Russia was on the side of Armenia. Russia had 2 military bases in Armenia, close to Yerevan and in Gumayri. They call Gümrüz Gumayri. And still Russia has its army, its bases in those 2 places. And later, when this 44-day war started, Russia just approached the border of Armenia and Azerbaijan and deployed its troops there. And prior to 10th of November, when the ceasefire agreement was signed, I'm speaking about the last war, then Russia started to exercise certain kind of influence over Azerbaijan. This is not well known publicly, but this is a truth that I'm going to speak about that later to some more extent. Okay, but there were certain flare-ups. So although it was the stage of de-escalation, the parties to conflict were in negotiations. They were meeting at presidential levels, at the level of ministers of foreign affairs, etc., tens of times at various countries in Russia, United States, France, etc. But there was no result. In the meantime, we had a couple of escalations, and the notable one happened in 2016, and the war lasted only 6 days, so we call it a 6-day war. And there was a huge loss on both sides, and there was a huge criticism against Azerbaijan that Azerbaijan disclosed its military might. But also there are some people who say that no, it was good because Azerbaijan gave a signal to Armenia. Azerbaijan tried to get its lands by means of diplomacy. It did not work. So then Azerbaijan offered Armenia money, $5 million, that hey, take this money and build your country where you live now in Armenia. And did not work. They offered Azerbaijan more money. But then when Azerbaijan understood that the only way to get its lands back is war, and resorting to war is a must, this 6-day war was one of those tests, as a matter of fact. But later, in summer of 2020, There was another clash, which we call Tobos clashes against. This was Azerbaijan blamed that Armenia started that, but then some people on the Azerbaijani side said that no, we started that. Just we wanted to again do another test. A famous Azerbaijani general was killed, and the public reaction to that was pretty harsh. So then we could really anticipate that the new wave, a longer and more devastating wave of war was inevitable, right? But again, Russia played a serious role in both cases to stop the war, and even sent an ultimatum to Azerbaijan that, hey, in case you start the war, the result's not going to be good for you. Armenia threatened Azerbaijan a number of times, saying that if you start another wave of another stage of war, then you're going to lose Janza. Janza is the second biggest city of Azerbaijan. Of course, Azerbaijan did not lose much time and started to build a better army. Conditions have changed. Azerbaijan made billions of dollars, petrodollars, which caused a lot of problems for Azerbaijan because the country is extremely corrupt, incredibly corrupt, and no rule of law, no separation of power. There's a kind of, I would say, a specific or idiosyncratic autocracy in Azerbaijan. But the truth is that Azerbaijan built an army because this was a matter of dignity for Azerbaijan, and people wanted to go to war. But the big mistake for the government was the fact that it kept the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict in its own hands, under its own monopoly. It did not want the public get involved in that, because when the public gets involved in this kind of cases, they also get involved in other problems. So again, in these two major clashes, Russia's role was significant. Okay, and then it came to 2020. So Nagorno-Karabakh region of Azerbaijan was under occupation for about 30 years at that time, and Armenia started to build, for Armenians at least, Nagorno-Karabakh Armenia started to build a state there, its own state. It had all elements of statehood. The only thing was that it was not recognized by foreign countries, and it's a subjective element of state, of a state of statehood. So Armenia, I'm gonna be fast. I know you have questions. Armenia and Azerbaijan, Armenia had its own new prime minister, Pashinyan, that was elected by citizens, and he wanted to pursue new policies, pro-Western policies against Russia. Russia did not like this and decided to help Azerbaijan to some extent. And this war lasted only 44 days. And as a result, Azerbaijan devastated Armenia's troops, and liberated most part of its lands, other than Nagorno-Karabakh. In terms of Nagorno-Karabakh, Azerbaijan liberated only the town of Hadrut, a few villages there, and the city of Shusha, with 2 villages only. The rest of Nagorno-Karabakh is still under Armenia's control, with Russia, together with Russia. So it was a great military victory for Azerbaijan. It was a great defeat, diplomatic defeat for Azerbaijan at the same time. People in Azerbaijan started to understand the truth that the result was not really in favor of Azerbaijan. It's not, because Russian troops are deployed in Nagorno-Karabakh, and Azerbaijan has no control, no jurisdiction in Nagorno-Karabakh. And Armenia feels more secure in Nagorno-Karabakh now than in the past. But Azerbaijan has certain gains. First, the status quo has changed because in the past it was a humiliation for Azerbaijan. It was a war of dignity, as a matter of fact, for Azerbaijanis, and they finally showed the world and Russia, enemy, the region, etc., that Azerbaijanis are able to fight, and they did. And they got all 7 administrative regions back, surrounding regions that are not included in the Nagorno-Karabakh region of Azerbaijan. Also, Azerbaijan gained psychological superiority over Armenians. They have another trauma. They started to speak about that. In the past, they were speaking about the so-called genocide, right? So-called. They claimed that there was one, and that has created a huge psychological trauma for Armenians. But now this is another trauma for them. And Azerbaijan also managed to liberate Shusha. Shusha is the cultural center of Azerbaijan. And Shusha is like a conservatory of Azerbaijan. That's a musical center. Azerbaijan's some of the most, I would say, important people just really are from Shusha. And Azerbaijan managed to liberate Shusha. That's also a gain. And of course, making Armenians to give some concessions was a big victory. Another gain of Azerbaijan is the fact that Turkish influence in the region increased significantly. Okay, but also Azerbaijan has some losses. A small part of Nagorno-Karabakh is liberated. As I mentioned at the beginning of this talk, in 1988. Armenians demanded only the Nagorno-Karabakh part of Azerbaijan, not more, but later they managed to occupy 3 times more lands. But the original want or original wish was the Nagorno-Karabakh region of Azerbaijan. Now they have most part of that region. Again, the only parts of that region that are under Azerbaijan's jurisdiction and control are Shusha and Hadrut, and that's it. And that's very insignificant part of this region. So that's why I consider this as Azerbaijan's loss. So Nagorno-Karabakh Armenians, Azerbaijani citizens, but there are a lot of Armenians, many more than Azerbaijani citizens. There are Armenians that moved there from Syria, etc., or Lebanon, for example, or other countries in the world. They are everywhere, you know. They are still living there. So that's why I can say that Nagorno-Karabakh Armenians, those are not Azerbaijan's citizens, and those who are Azerbaijan citizens are not integrated to Azerbaijan. Okay? There is no control of Baku over Nagorno-Karabakh, no jurisdiction, no control. It's primarily that land is controlled by Russian troops and then by Armenians. And the integration process is taking place, of course, there, but with Armenia, not with Azerbaijan. Okay, these are Azerbaijan's losses. Also, Lachin corridor. Lachin is one of those administrative centers that was liberated by Azerbaijan. There's a huge land, a chunk of land or piece of land is given to Armenians. Armenian control, Russian control, that gonna be a kind of a bridge between Nagorno-Karabakh and Armenia. And we don't see any visible signs that Nagorno-Karabakh is part of Azerbaijan, not only because we are not there, but also because there is no integration with us, with Azerbaijan. And the document that was signed by Putin and Pashinyan and Aliyev on 10th of November last year is not strong because there are a lot of gray areas. Okay, it does not speak about the political status of the region. Aliyev announced a couple of times and orally that there's gonna be no status, but it's not enough, you know. In law, it should be written. I wish they added the 10th article to that statement on the status that all the problems Armenians have in Nagorno-Karabakh gonna be resolved within the territorial integrity of Azerbaijan. For example, there is not anything like that. And the statement is too general. And also, there are some missed opportunities. Azerbaijan stopped the war before it liberated the entire occupied region. Azerbaijan was supposed to continue the war and liberate Nagorno-Karabakh part of Azerbaijan as well. At least Azerbaijan was supposed to get Hankendi. That's the capital of Nagorno-Karabakh. Armenians call it Stepanakert. Because when you get the capital, then you can really establish your rule there. So, for example, Baku could get Hankendi and then have local elections there, or general elections, and say, elect your people to represent you in Baku, in our parliament, and the situation would be different today. But Baku did not make any visible change in political status of Nagorno-Karabakh. Now, there are some interpretations that because of Russia, because Putin agreed to give Azerbaijan, to allow Azerbaijan to do this much. So if this is the case, it's very bad. But this is the reality what we have today. So why permanent peace is delayed? As the problem is not resolved, as you say, the problem is not resolved. Still, Armenians claim that Nagorno-Karabakh belongs to them, and Azerbaijan claims that there is no status that's part of Azerbaijan. This is the reality. If the status of the region, political status, is not resolved, it means that the war is not over. So this is a new stage of this conflict, which is peaceful at this point. It's not too peaceful because people get died there, soldiers, combatants. The second is that Russia's interests are the source of problem in the region. Russia is there, while Russia was not there. Russia was not in Azerbaijan for more than 25 years. Russian troops were sent out of Azerbaijan when Elchibey was the president of Azerbaijan. But Russia came back to Azerbaijan. If we claim that Nagorno-Karabakh is part of Azerbaijan, then Russian troops are in Azerbaijan. If we say that Russian troops are not in Azerbaijan, then we mean that Nagorno-Karabakh is not part of Azerbaijan. So you see, Russia's interests are there in the region. Russia has strategic interests and political economic interests in the region. Russia wants to keep Armenia and Azerbaijan, both of them, under its control. And Russia allows them to act freely to the extent Russia wants. And that's it. And the governments of Armenia and Azerbaijan have clashing interests, of course. They can't agree at this point. We'll see what can happen in the future. And finally, the public, the people other than the governments, right? They are not involved in the resolution process or peace building process, because it's impossible that governments sign a document and then people agree with everything. Eventually people gonna either object or accept maybe. But when you just let people also get involved in the process, peace building process, it's more trustworthy and long lasting. People know how to resolve their problems much better than governments, because governments pursue their interests. Their interest pursuing actors. And, you know, in this case, we don't speak about liberalism, liberal values, etc. This is all about realism. And the conflict is enlarged enormously. So there are new parties to the conflict. But at the same time, of course, we can speak about shrinking, because, say, the US and some other countries are not really active actors in this case. But you see, Iran now has a new position, new policies, because Iran also has been affected by the result of this war, and Russia again, France, etc. So when the conflict in general has more actors, then the more actors, the harder to resolve it. Because if you have a conflict with a person, with a single party, and if there are just two parties, they can negotiate, it's easier, right? But then when others are involved, it means that they bring their interests to that conflict, and that's harder to negotiate and find a common ground. Unfortunately, Azerbaijan failed to establish its sole authority in the region. This is the reality, but the government of Azerbaijan claims the opposite. They say, no, we are the authority in the region. And the reality is that today Armenia enjoys full authority and full jurisdiction over Nagorno-Karabakh. But of course, this is not justification. They show that, we see that they act like a state, like a government there. But this does not still mean that they have a legitimate right to those lands. Okay, I'll stop here, and thank you for your questions in advance.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you for your analysis, and thank you for concise but comprehensive overview of the conflict with its multiple aspects and in terms of history and current state. And now for 15 minutes or so, we are going to have some Q&A session, short Q&A session. But before I ask my questions, let me remind our viewers that if they are willing to submit a question to our speaker, please do so by posting your question on the comment section of the YouTube live stream. And Professor Askerov, perhaps one of the most important points that should not be overlooked in this question is the problem of wider regional ramification of Second Karabakh War, which I would like to open with our discussion. Now, if we go beyond the Nagorno-Karabakh and look at the issue of frozen conflicts and the de facto states in post-Soviet space from a general perspective, we see that similar outcome, meaning that a sudden change of the status quo as a result of short but decisive war, may emerge in other present conflicts in the region, like South Ossetia, Abkhazia, Transnistria, and recently emerged conflict in eastern Ukraine. Since none of these territorial predicaments, despite internationally mediated conflict resolution efforts, have found their final resolution, and there is no guarantee that these disputes will not pursue a similar to Karabakh war trajectory. In this regard, what is your assessment? Can we face a situation when, in the foreseeable future, when Georgia, Ukraine, or Moldova, supported by one or a group of external powers, re-establish their territorial integrity by resorting to war with their breakaway territory? Or in the contrary, can we see a de facto state resorting to an armed conflict and to complete its secession with the subsequent incorporation, for example, into the external benefactor, which is Russia in most of the cases? What is your assessment in this case?
Thank you. This is a general question, or broad question, not general. So it's very, it requires a lot of time to answer it, but I'm gonna try to answer it briefly, given the fact that we don't have much time now left. So the Nagorno-Karabakh war, the second Karabakh war, in fact, that's the third Karabakh war, but we call it second, that's fine. The first was during the Azerbaijan Democratic Republic that existed in 1918 and 1920, that was occupied by the Red Army. So anyway, this one is a source of aspiration for those states and countries like Georgia, Ukraine, Moldova, but at the same time, it's a source of disappointment. Now they saw that, yeah, it's possible, Azerbaijan did that, maybe we can do that. But also it's impossible for them. They understand that Azerbaijan did that. That does not mean that, does not necessarily means that they can do it. So they get disappointed. So one of the common interpretations is the fact that they believe that Azerbaijan had Turkey and Pakistan behind it. And they say, hey, we don't have supporters, like Georgia says, like Turkey and Pakistan to support us. But the truth is that Azerbaijan is fought right in the field, war field. So Azerbaijan purchased the technology from Israel and from Turkey, and then Bayraktars, etc., those kind of sophisticated new technology. But it was Azerbaijani army, soldiers, people that really led the war, right? And this is one point, but Georgia does not have that kind of, for example, say, resources resources that Azerbaijan has. But that's not the main issue. The main issue is that the conflicts Georgia has are different from the one of Nagorno-Karabakh, say South Ossetia or Abkhazia, etc. Each of them have each of these conflicts has idiosyncratic, specific, unique characters, right? So they should be evaluated within its own context. Nonetheless, they have also specific characteristics, that's true, but also they have very commonalities with some other post-Soviet conflicts. And one of them is Russia. Of course, Russia's interests are involved in all of these. Yeah. You cannot change anything without the consent of Russia. It's very hard. It's almost incredibly hard. You got to negotiate. You got to give Russia something. Like in Azerbaijan's case, right? We negotiated with Russia secretly. That's I say secretly, but we can understand it, right? After all, that hey, we can advance to a certain point, and you're gonna get this. For example, you're gonna bring your troops to Nagorno-Karabakh, for example, and or there should be something else that Russia should give you support, right? Like Pashinyan wanted really to integrate Armenia to the West, and Russia was unhappy with that. So Russia said, "Oh, I gotta punish Pashinyan," but to some extent, okay, because still there should be a new balance in Russia's favor, and that happened. So in Ukraine, Russia occupied and annexed Crimea without serious foreign protests, right? I mean, West was against Russia, but that did not change anything. That was an incredible crisis, right? In our modern times, one can't believe that's the demise of, I would say, system or state. See, nothing happened. So Russia started a new warfare in Donbass, right? In eastern Ukraine, and still no serious protest against him, right? It's open external aggression, but Russia can't do that. But Ukraine is a much bigger state than Azerbaijan and Georgia are. Ukraine has potential to fight back and Ukraine may be able to change the situation there, but I doubt about Moldova, for example. So bottom line is that all of them have some specific characteristics, but also some similarities. As long as Russia's interests and Russia itself are involved in those conflicts, resolving them fully would be impossible. But they can, of course, gonna go from one stage to another, okay, because conflict has different stages, right? So it escalates, de-escalates, then there's stalemate, negotiations, etc., but then flare-ups suddenly, certain clashes, but then again negotiations, etc. So Russia manages those conflicts the way Russia wants, in line with its interests. Thank you.
Okay. And another issue, again, a general issue actually, is what I would like to focus on is the diversification of actors in the region, which you also mentioned in your presentation. The role traditionally played by Russia in post-Soviet space as a whole, and in terms of the territorial disputes, as exemplified by the Second Karabakh War, is accompanied by kind of multiplication of actors, which means that new major players managed to enter the scene and change the balance of power relations. In terms of the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, this is actually Turkey. And in Turkey, especially Turkey's involvement increased its importance not only in the Caucasus, but potentially and in the long run also maybe in the Turkic-speaking republics of Central Asia. And it is what we see here is a rapid strengthening of Turkey in post-Soviet space at the expense of Russian influence. Does Turkey have this kind of capacity to compete with Russia in this wide geography?
We say diversification, but the fact is that Russia ousted certain actors from the region and established its own monopoly there. Like in the past, for example, there was the Minsk group of the Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe, right? And Russia was only one of them, but Russia now is a sole, really, I would say, sole authority in Nagorno-Karabakh region. So, okay, Turkey is there, but before Turkish authorities were saying that we're gonna be there in Nagorno-Karabakh with the same status what Russia has, right? Do you remember those days? Well, what's Turkish status there? Almost nothing. This is the reality. So Russia, again, established itself as the sole authority in the region, if not the sole authority, but the main authority in the region. And of course, Turkish, presence in the Southern Caucasus is good for, especially for Azerbaijan. It tries to balance the Russian politics there, but again, we cannot compare them to each other. Okay, Turkish position is extremely, extremely weak still. Okay, better than in the past, but still weak. But what's Turkish gain? Turkey showed Russia, the regional countries, Iran, and the West that Turkey has some technology that's really worth of attention, you know. And Turkey is capable of something. And Turkey is ready to help Azerbaijan in any case. It was not the case in the past, right? In 1990s, early 1990s, people of Turkey believed that Turkey supported Azerbaijan, but Azerbaijan received extremely little, very little support from Turkey in 1990s. Maybe Özal would help Azerbaijan, maybe, but he died, right? Was killed, maybe. But then none of the governments helped Azerbaijan to the extent that Azerbaijan could make some change in the region, right? And even one of the governments just wanted to organize a coup in Azerbaijan, Tansu Çiller, if you remember. That was Turkish help. Now look, Turkey has established itself, or has showed itself capable of helping Azerbaijan in any case, under any situation. That's a big change, big development. So in early 1990s, Turkey wanted to establish itself as a leader, maybe in Central Asia. It did not happen. So we lost 30 years. Okay, TICA was established at that time that would play a main role. The US was interested in Turkish, I would say, new relations with the Central Asian countries. In America, the US wanted to go to Central Asia through Turkey and spent billions of dollars on this. And where are those money? Where is the result? Most of the Turkey countries, if not all of them, are extremely corrupt and no serious change. Now, saying that Turkey is really strong in South Caucasus, that's another lie. But Turkey is in South Caucasus and the situation is much better than in the past. That's true. Yeah, I agree with that. So I expect from Turkey a better, more active foreign policy, and Turkey is capable of that. And people around the world now see Turkey as a real regional leader, regional power. That's another truth. So Turkey should act accordingly, but shouldn't wait until Putin dies. You know. Thank you.
Thank you, Ali Hocam. And I think we are coming to the end of our event, and we have to go. We have to conclude actually. Dr. Askerov, once again, I would like to express my gratitude and appreciation to you for taking the time and for your willingness to join us this early morning hour. We greatly appreciate it. And we also would be pleased to see you in Istanbul in our university's future events when we are able to turn our offline events into normal seminars and conferences. Thank you so much for coming, and I hope to see you again. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. My pleasure.
Thank you.
Hocam kapatıyorum yayını. İyi günler diliyorum. Saygılar.